Before we go into the reign of good King Josiah and the closing days of southern Judah, I ask you to look at the king chart and let us see the relationship of these 5 kings, because this is an important section and their relationship helps us to understand how these things are going to unfold as we see the close of this kingdom. After Josiah, there was the king Jehoahaz. Jehoahaz was his son, the first of 3 sons of Josiah that would serve as king. Following him was Jehoiakim. You'll notice his name would end with an M. That was the second son of Josiah that would serve as king. The next was Jehoiakim. That ended with an N. He was the son of Jehoiakim. That would mean he would be the grandson of Josiah. And then there was Zedekiah. Zedekiah was the third and final son of Josiah to serve as king, and the final king of southern Judah. Now we read about Josiah beginning with the 22nd chapter of 2 Kings. And we get the impression right away of his good intentions and his good reign because of his efforts to replenish and restore the temple, to repair the things that had been broken down. After a number of years of 2 wicked kings, why things had gone into a great physical and spiritual disrepair, and Josiah tried to bring about a reform. And he was the last to make an effort to reform the people of southern Judah. In the process of trying to restore things, they found in the sort of ruined temple a copy of God's law. Now that would be a rather startling thing. You would expect to find that. But nonetheless, somebody had either hidden that law or the enemies had either overlooked in their efforts to destroy the law. And nonetheless, they found it, they read it, and it was read to the king. And when the king read it, he was very much distressed by it. And the reason he was distressed was because he saw the variance between what the law required and how the people had conducted themselves and how they had lived. And he was quite disturbed, and so he asked his men to seek out the meaning of these things, and they solicited the aid of a woman, a prophetess, named Huldah. Huldah told them to go back and tell Josiah that they indeed were at variance with God's law, and the end of the kingdom was sure to come. It would not come in the days of Josiah, but it would sure to come because of the wickedness of the people. It is, I think, in the 23rd chapter of 2 Kings that we see the greatness of Josiah. Here, even though he knew the kingdom was sure to fall, Huldah had made that plain. God's wrath was going to come against it. He would no longer tolerate their rebellion against them. Nonetheless, Josiah did everything that he could to help those people that were still living to try to be faithful to God. Now, he knew he was not going to preserve the kingdom. But nonetheless, in spite of the fact that he knew his efforts would not be wholly successful, he would do what he could for the spiritual welfare of those round about him. And if we look at the 23rd chapter, we will see that he would go to the house of the Lord. He would try to restore the different things that needed to be restored. He brought forth out of the temple the vessels of Baal, and he put the vessels of God back in the temple. He put down the idolatrous priests. Verse 5, he brought out the groves of the house of the Lord. He burned those things that needed to be burned. Verse 7, he brake down the houses of the Sodomites. Verse 8, he defiled the high places where the priest had burned incense. He did all of these things to try to show the people the way that God wanted them to live. And I think, folks, that's a lesson for us, that even though we may not be successful in being able to accomplish everything we would want to accomplish and have things like we would want them to be, should we not put forth every effort that we can for our benefit and for the benefit of those round about us, to do everything that we can for the spiritual benefit as long as we can? And that's what Josiah did. And that's one of the things that certainly he was great. Yes, Brother Tommy.
I think this is a real lesson for our young people too. How old was Josiah when he's doing all these things? He was very young still.
Well, he was relatively young. He reigned for, I think, 31 years, and he died rather young.
Well, he was 8 years old when he began to reign, and he found the book when he was 26. So he was very young. So
he was young, and it's a good lesson too for older people. You know, someone has said that there's no fool like an old fool. Well, I guess I don't know. I don't say that as much as I used to for some reason. But nonetheless, he was a real aggressive person to try to get people to do the things that he ought to do. Notice verse 14 for a moment. And he brake in pieces the images and cut down the groves and filled their places with the bones of men. And verse 15, moreover the altar that was at Bethel, and the high place which Jeroboam the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin, had made, both that altar and the high place he brake down, and burned the high place, and stamped it in small to powder, and burned the grove. It had been prophesied by that unnamed prophet in the 13th chapter of 1 Kings that there would be one named Josiah who would destroy that altar that Jeroboam raised when he changed all the things that God wanted him to do. God's prophecy is being fulfilled. Josiah turned himself, but he did not spare the sepulchre of the false prophets, but he did spare the sepulchres of the true prophets of God, especially the true prophet that had prophesied concerning what would happen to that altar of Jeroboam. Josiah, I suppose, second to Hezekiah, was the greatest reformer for southern Judah, possibly the best king of Israel outside of David. He was indeed an outstanding individual, but his efforts were futile as far as the preservation of the nation was concerned, and that was because of the intense, long-range, long-time evil that the people had practiced and that the kings had practiced. And not only that, he instigated a return to the observance of the Passover in verse 21. He even invited people that were the remnant of northern Israel that were about. People came, and there had not been a celebration of the Passover like that since the time of David. And so you can see the great success that he was having for the people of his time, but it was just temporary. It would not change what God had determined for that nation because of the wickedness of that nation. It was just too late. Verse 26 says, Notwithstanding, the Lord turned not from the fierceness of his great wrath, wherewith his anger was kindled against Judah, because of all the provocation that Manasseh had provoked him withal. And he said he was going to remove Judah out of his sight. He would cast off Jerusalem. There just simply wasn't any way for that nation to have lived so long in wickedness to escape the consequences and the results of their evil. Indeed, righteousness exalteth a nation. Sin is a reproach to any people. Be sure your sins will find you out. Southern Judah is about to reap what they had sown, just as their northern cousins had done. But to the credit of Josiah, Josiah's efforts were cut short. This brings us to the observation of the international power of Assyria. Assyria, you will remember, was the power that had taken northern Israel into captivity. Assyria was the power that had threatened Jerusalem, but had failed to take Jerusalem. And you will remember, even in the days of Hezekiah, there was the beginning of another empire, and that was the Babylonian Empire. And it continued to grow in power. It became a threat to the Assyrian Empire, and it was in the days of Josiah that the Babylonian Empire overpowered the Assyrian Empire and became the world empire and the power of the time. Now, it was at this time that Pharaoh Necho, he was the king of Egypt. Egypt was to the south of Judah, and he was going either to the assistance or to the opposition of the Assyrians, as some conflict in the minds of some as to what he was intending to do. But regardless of what Pharaoh was intending to do, to accomplish his purposes, he was going to have to march through Judah to go to either help or to attack Assyria, and either to help Babylon or to be an opponent to Babylon. Josiah was very jealous of his nation. He was not going to allow the king of Egypt to march through his land for any purpose. And so when the king of Egypt came up from the south to go through Judah and to accomplish the purposes that he intended, Josiah said, "You don't pass." And they engaged in battle. Unfortunately, Josiah was killed in battle at the age of 31, and he was brought back to Jerusalem and buried. And the people then put Jehoahaz, his son, as king. The Egyptians did not like the idea of Jehoahaz being king. So they marched in and took Jehoahaz off of the throne and took Jehoahaz down into Egypt as a captive. And so the people then put Jehoiakim on the throne, the second son of Josiah. Now, Jehoiakim was a very wicked person. A couple of instances to show how wicked he was, and we read a good deal about Jehoiakim in the book of Jeroboam. He put Jeroboam in a pit, left to leave there to die. He was rescued by an Ethiopian.
Jeremiah.
What did I say?
Jeroboam.
Well, I shouldn't have said that. Thank you. Yeah, Jeremiah, the prophet Jeremiah. And also, he was the king that when Jeremiah wrote something, he took his penknife and cut it up and burned it. That showed how much respect he had for the prophet's message from God. And he was a very wicked man. At first he was sort of passive toward Egypt, but then Pharaoh Necho was not the great power. The Babylonians were. Nebuchadnezzar was the power. Nebuchadnezzar came in to attack southern Judah, and he threatened southern Judah, and Jehoiakim rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar. Well, that was a mistake on his part, because Nebuchadnezzar just simply marched in, defeated Jehoiakim, took him off as a captive, some of the Jews as a captive, some of the treasures as captive, and took them into captivity. And the people of Judah were carried off into captivity, folks, in 3 separate movements. And those that were carried off at the time of Jehoiakim, that was the first movement. It's interesting to also remember that this was the time when Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were carried off into Babylonian captivity at the time that Jehoiakim fell. And then Nebuchadnezzar put Jehoiakim, his son, the grandson of Josiah, on the throne. Well, it so happens that so many times when a man was placed on the throne as king, for a while he would go along and pretended loyalty, but he would raise a rebellion against the higher powers, and he too raised a rebellion against Nebuchadnezzar, and Nebuchadnezzar would not tolerate it, and he came into Judah again, and he took Jehoiakim off as a captive with his mother and with his family, with a lot of the Jews. And by the way, this was the time when Ezekiel was carried away into captivity. And so the second movement of deportation of the people of Judah was carried off into Babylonian captivity. Now I want us to focus just a moment upon this man Jehoiakim. As I've told you before, these people, these kings, had various and sundry names. Jehoiakim was also called Jeconiah. He was also called Coniah. I want you to turn in your Bible to Jeremiah chapter 22 and verse 30. Jeremiah 22 and verse 30. Jeremiah had this to say about Jehoiakim or Coniah or Jeconiah. He said, Jeremiah 22, what did I say? Okay, I'm not listening to what I'm saying. In verse 30, write ye this man childless, a man that shall not prosper in his days, for no man of his seed shall prosper, sitting upon the throne of David and ruling any more in Judah. Now I want you to notice, this man Coniah had children, but he did not have children that would be a king. Usually a man's child would be the next king. There was a king after Jehoiakim, but the king was Zedekiah. Zedekiah was not a descendant of Jehoiakim. Zedekiah was his uncle. So there would be no descendant of Coniah or Jehoiakim that would ever rule in Judah anymore. Now keep in mind that Jerusalem is in the province of Judah. If you will turn in your New Testament to Matthew chapter 1, verse 11 and 12, you will find in the genealogy of Jesus Christ that Jesus is a fleshly descendant of this very man, of which it is said by the prophet Jeremiah, there will be no fleshly descendant to ever reign in Jerusalem ever again. Now, why is that important to me and you? That's because of the false doctrine that people teach that Jesus is going to come and reign in Jerusalem for 1,000 years. He's not going to enter such a done it. He couldn't do it unless Jeremiah is a false prophet, and he's not. Jeremiah says none of his seed is going to reign in Judah or Jerusalem anymore. Jesus is a descendant of this very man. Therefore, if Jesus reigns in Jerusalem, he will make Jeremiah a false prophet. Therefore, we are left with a choice. Shall we agree with that false doctrine, or shall we accept Jesus as a descendant of this man and Jeremiah, a prophet of God that tells the truth that Jesus will not reign in Jerusalem? That's just one of a multitude of unget-overable arguments to show the falsity of that idea of 1,000 years reign of Jesus in Jerusalem. You need to keep that in mind. But this man, he was carried off into captivity, and that was the second migration of the people of Judah into Babylon. And placed in his stead was his uncle Zedekiah. Zedekiah ruled, I think, for about 12 years, but he also sort of got the big head. He rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar, and that was the final thing for Nebuchadnezzar. He came into Judah, and when he came, he commissioned his people to destroy the city completely. They tore down the great temple that Solomon had built. They tore down the walls of Jerusalem. They took the people, all of them that amounted to anything, off into captivity. They took all of the vessels that had been made by which the people were to worship God and carried them into Babylon. As for Zedekiah, he tried to escape, but they captured him. And the last thing that Zedekiah saw was his sons being killed before his very eyes. And then his eyes were put out, and he was carried into Babylon as a captive, and he died as a captive in Babylon. And the captivity of Judah carried into Babylon was now complete, and southern Judah was a nation no more. The kingdom was now collapsed. The divided kingdom had come to a close. Now, there was a man that ruled after that, but he was just a governor appointed by Nebuchadnezzar. His name was Gedaliah. Gedaliah was appointed, but there were some that hated him because he was of Nebuchadnezzar, and they hated Nebuchadnezzar, and so they murdered Gedaliah, and they fled to Egypt. They thought they would be safe in Egypt. Jeremiah told them, don't do it. They did it anyway. He told them not to flee to Egypt. You can't escape. But they went to Egypt anyway. And sure enough, here comes Nebuchadnezzar, and he goes down and defeats Egypt. And while he's down there, he captured these people that had killed Gedaliah, and he puts them to death. He doesn't put Jeremiah to death, because Jeremiah, he felt, had been pretty much on his side. Jeremiah wasn't on his side. Jeremiah just tried to get the people not to rebel against Nebuchadnezzar, because he knew what Nebuchadnezzar would do to Jerusalem if they fought against him. They fought against him. Jeremiah says, don't do it. They went ahead and did it anyway, and Jerusalem was absolutely leveled to the ground and burned to ashes. But Jeremiah died in Egypt. But that's the end of southern Judah. That's the end of both of these nations. That's the beginning of the 70 years of captivity in Babylon, of which Jeremiah had prophesied would take place. And that 70 years captivity continued until the time that Babylon was overthrown by the Persians, and it was under the Persians that the Jews were allowed under Zerubbabel and Ezra and Nehemiah to return back to their home. And then the Persians were overcome by the Grecians, and it is at that point that the biblical historical record closes. And from that point until Matthew, a period of about some 400 years, the Bible doesn't give what takes place in history, but Daniel had prophesied what would take place. Sometime you would spend your time very profitably studying that 400-year period between Malachi and Matthew to help you understand the conditions, the parties, the tensions, the problems, and all the situations that existed when Christ came into the world. A very important period. It's called the period between the Testaments. That will terminate our study on the divided kingdom. That's just a segment of the history of this ancient Israel, this important nation through which our Lord was brought to this earth. But a very important segment it was. And we learned God's dealings with His Word, His people, His prophets, His promises, His warnings. Thank you so much for allowing me to discuss these things with you, and that will conclude our Divided Kingdom study.